Hello, Hidden Gems. Welcome to our Friday night live. We're so glad to see everyone here already in chat. So many familiar faces and names. I guess not faces, we can't see you, but so many familiar names. I feel like I can see you. We feel like we can see you. Stephanie B, thanks for reminding everyone that while waiting for our show to start or whenever you can to support us by hitting that like button, subscribing, and sharing our channel with your friends. I mentioned earlier in the week that we might cover the Murdaugh murders this week. That was the plan, right, John? We had these plans to cover the Murdaugh case today, but we're going to do that when? Soon?
Yeah, I think it was a little more overwhelming than we had anticipated. So we've been following it from the sidelines, but we realize that it's such a tangled web that it's going to require to do a deep dive. It's going to require a little bit more time and effort. So we're going to get to it. And we hope to provide a deep dive into that case, which I'm not sure anyone's really done yet, but we will dive as deep as we can, but we need to take a little more time to get all the information and put it together and make sense of it.
Yes, we will dive into that case like no one has before. And that's been asked of us, and we plan to. I've been watching the trial daily. And in fact, I'll be on News Nation later tonight on Ashley Banfield on a panel discussing the possibilities and different theories out there in the Murdaugh trial. So I am with all of you watching that. Thank you for coming here tonight, though, for another important case that Dr. John and I have been covering. We talked about it last week. To give a brief overview of those that are new, Lindsey Clancy is a mother in Massachusetts, 32-year-old mother who strangled her 3 children while her husband went to grab takeout. We discussed postpartum depression, postpartum psychosis last Friday, and this week we have an update. Lindsey Clancy was arraigned, and we want to show a bit of that arraignment to help explain and give a summary of what we learned this week, and then discuss it. Because, John, as you said, the new information changes things for you. Is that right?
It presents a different picture than last week for sure. So I think it's worth discussing because the prosecution, the DA had a lot of information that we didn't know, and it's interesting information. I'm not sure it changes anything. I still think that Lindsey Clancy fits probably the category that we talked about last week of psychotic/depressed type mother for filicide. I don't think it changes that, but it certainly raises some questions. So I don't have any answers here. I think we need to have a discussion about this. I'm not professing to have a strong opinion here. I think ultimately the Lindsey Clancy case will be decided by experts who interview her and spend a lot of time with her and really do a deep dive and figure out what's going on, and that is not me at the moment. So, but I think the new information is interesting and it's worth talking about, and I think it can hopefully enlarge our understanding of filicide.
All right. With that being said, let's play a bit of this arraignment. Let's watch this together. And John, make sure to put your mic on mute when I play this. I'll do the same just in case there is an echo.
Okay.
All right.
Juvenile 1. Count 2, 265, Section 1, murder, juvenile. The plea of not guilty will be entered. Please be advised while this case is pending, any violation of state, federal, or local law may result in bail being revoked and be held without bail.
One of the first questions that Lindsey Clancy asked was, do I need an attorney? She knew that she had murdered her children, and she had the clarity, focus, and mental acumen to focus on protecting her own rights and interests. On the morning of Tuesday, January 24th, 2023, the defendant took her 5-year-old daughter, Cora, to the pediatrician's for an appointment. She interacted with a receptionist, nursing staff, and a doctor. There were apparently no issues with the defendant's demeanor or behavior as she completed the appointment and was allowed to leave with Cora without any issues or concerns. When she returned home, she went outside with Cora and her 3-year-old son, Dawson, to play in the snow. They built a snowman. The defendant sent photos to her mother and to her husband. She texted with them Nothing in the text was out of the ordinary or any sign of any distress or trouble. Back inside later that day at 4:02 p.m., the defendant searched on her phone Kids Miralax. She then searched at Takeout 3V via her cell phone at 4:13 p.m. Immediately after doing that, she used Apple Maps on her phone to determine how long it would take someone to drive from her home in Duxbury to 3V restaurant in Plymouth. So she would know how long someone would be gone if they ran that errand. At 4:53 p.m., the defendant texted her husband, who was working in his home office in their basement. She texted, "Any chance you want to do takeout from 3V? I didn't cook anything. It's been a long day." This was an unusual request, as when the family ordered takeout, they'd usually go somewhere closer to home, but it was a place that they had been in the past. Patrick Clancy texted back yes, and then the defendant asked him to check the menu. At 5:06 p.m., the husband texted the defendant asking what she was going to get. She responded, "A Mediterranean power bowl." She spelled it correctly, and it was something that was on the menu. He then told her that he wanted the scallop and pork belly risotto. At 5:10 p.m., the defendant called 3V Restaurant to place the order. She got the order correct. She gave the correct name for pickup, Patrick. The hostess who took the call said there was nothing out of the ordinary about this call. She was able to understand the defendant, that her voice was not slurred or impaired in any way. At 5:15 p.m., Patrick Clancy headed out the door to run these errands at the defendant's request. As he left, she texted him Pedialyte liquid stool softener. Surveillance footage shows Mr. Clancy at CVS on Summer Street in Kingston at 5:32 p.m. He goes to the medication aisle, the children's medication aisle. Phone records show that he called the defendant at 5:33 p.m. and she did not answer the phone. She then calls him back at 5:34 p.m. and the call lasted 14 seconds. He's there at the store unsure of which medication to get, and she tells him exactly what she wants. He had no issues communicating with her. It was a completely normal call, although he did mention that she seemed like she was in the middle of something. He is on surveillance footage during this time, exiting that aisle and appeared to be using his phone. He then heads to the register, makes his purchase, and leaves the store at 5:37 p.m. He's next seen on footage at 3V Restaurant at 5:54 p.m. He picks up the food and he's out of there within a minute. When he arrives home, the first thing he noticed was the silence. He did not see or hear the defendant or the children. He actually called her cell phone at 6:09 p.m. looking for them, and she did not answer. He went to their bedroom on the second floor and the door was locked. He was able to open it, and when he looked inside, he saw blood on the floor in front of a full-length mirror and the window open. He immediately runs downstairs and into the backyard, where he finds the defendant laying on the ground. She appeared to have cuts on her wrists and neck, but he stated to 911 that those wounds were no longer bleeding. She was conscious. He called 911. During this time, he asked the defendant, "What did you do?" She responded to him, "I tried to kill myself and jumped out the window." During the 911 call, Patrick can be heard asking the defendant, "Where are the kids?" He later told police that she replied, "In the basement." So immediately after this happened, she knew what she had done and she knew where the kids were. When EMS arrived, he asked them to stay with her so he could go find his kids. The 911 call kept going. Patrick can be heard on the 911 call entering the home and heading to the basement. At one point, he calls out, "Guys." He can then be heard screaming in agony and shock as he found his children. His screams seem to get louder and more agonized as the time passes. Cora and Callan were on the floor in the den area of the finished basement, which is to the left when you walk down the stairs, while Dawson was alone on the floor in his father's home office, which is to the right when you go down the stairs. Each child still had the exercise band that was used to strangle them tied around their necks when their father found them. Dawson and Callan were face down on the floor. Cora was on her side with her torso turned towards the floor. He removed the bands and begged them to breathe. He continued to scream uncontrollably and screamed for officers to come to the basement. The dispatchers are hearing this and they send help down to the basement, and when they encounter Patrick, he yells out, "She killed the kids." The police rushed the children to ambulances that brought them to the hospital, and unfortunately, Cora and Dawson were declared dead at the hospital. Callan was med-flighted to Boston Children's Hospital. Medical staff was able to restart his pulse, but not his brain activity. He was placed on life support for several days before passing away. The defendant was transported to South Shore Hospital and then to a Boston area hospital where she remains. She sustained several broken bones in her back and her rib cage. The police were able to find several notebooks in the defendant's home pursuant to a search warrant, and also notes on her phone that were similar to journal entries. In the months, weeks, and days preceding January 24th, 2023, the defendant meticulously detailed her daily activities, her children's lives, her mental state, and her medication use. Her writing was clear, precise, and articulate. She never indicated that she was hallucinating, delusional, or had disordered thoughts or speech. In all of her writing, she appears to know who she is, where she is, the date, and with whom she's interacted. She wrote a note on her phone the day before killing the children, stating that she had, quote, a touch of postpartum anxiety, end quote, around returning to work.
So you have a paraplegic who can't walk, who is definitely a danger to herself, and the government wants to put her in where? Framingham State Prison? Plymouth House of Correction? There's no way that any humane person would do that, especially within the structure of our criminal justice system, where a person is presumed innocent. And I'm not suggesting with the facts that the government has read, but she has a good defense. She's got a darn good defense to this case, because that's what happened. And I just want to share with you, Your Honor, one of the things that's interesting. When I was in the House, I came across a drawer that had a bunch of pill bottles in it, and I called the DA and I said, I got these pill bottles, and we made arrangements. I'm going to be giving them to them. And it's all the Prozac and the Trazodone and all that stuff. But inside the drawer was this little vase, and I didn't know what it was. It just looked like a little vase to me. And my wife said to me, oh, that looks like a wish vase. I said, what's a wish vase? She said, when people write down little wishes and they put little pieces of paper and they put them inside the vase. And there are literally dozens of these little pieces of paper that talk about Lindsay's wish for happiness and health for her children, that she could get pregnant again, that she would be able to be with her children, little Callan, Dawson, Cora, that they would be happy, healthy, and successful. This is not a woman, Your Honor, that had any reason to harm those innocent children. My request, Your Honor, is that the court would put her on a GPS if you feel that's required, and let the doctors continue to treat her, let her go to Spalding Rehab.
So clearly a very difficult thing to listen to. It certainly has, for us to hear the new details, which is why John and I keep discussing this case in our home, because it's just so hard to make sense of for me, you know. And so here I am asking Dr. John, who happens to be, for those new to our channel, my husband. So sometimes he's Dr. Babe. He's a forensic and clinical psychologist who evaluates criminals and has worked with victims for many years. And I am his wife. I am a investigative journalist and was a TV reporter for 10 years. Anyway, after watching that, I guess I want to ask you, John, what your thoughts are, because this new information really threw me through a loop this week, trying to understand it.
It certainly complicates the picture quite a bit. I think, as I just said earlier, I think for me, this raises more questions than answers. I don't really have a strong opinion here, but I do want to raise some questions. I noticed we're already getting some great comments in chat, and I think we'll have a dialogue about this. But oftentimes when I think of filicide, I think of the famous quote from Hamlet. So at the beginning of Hamlet, there's a couple of sentries on the roof of the battlement. They're protecting the castle, and Hamlet's father's ghost appears. And Hamlet's father's ghost, who's King Hamlet, he says, "Murder most foul, strange, and unnatural." It's a famous line from Hamlet. And I don't know if I probably won't win any awards for my Shakespearean interpretation there, but this whole idea of murder being foul, strange, and unnatural, I think applies to filicide. That I think filicide is one of those types of murders that's really, really hard to understand and to wrap one's mind around, including myself. No matter how
Yes.
many times I see it or think about it, it's so unnatural.
Yes.
And so I think that quote, really strikes me emotionally when I think of filicide and I think of this case, because most of us recognize that killing children is not normal, and it's so outside the range of normality that it can have such a huge impact. So having said that, I want to address what the prosecution talked about, and I'm going to read a quote here from Alice Walker. Alice Walker is a Swiss psychiatrist. She's well known for a book called The Drama of the Gifted Child. She also wrote a book about the criminal mind that fewer people are aware of, called For Your Own Good. This is from that particular book. Walker says, every crime contains a concealed story that can be deciphered from the way the misdeed is enacted and from its specific details. The Walker quote, I think, is important in this scenario or this context, in terms of asking the question, is there a concealed story here? And how can we decipher that story from the misdeed? So when you learn that the children are strangled with an exercise band, I noticed somebody said in the comments that they'll never see exercise bands the same way. I agree.
Right. Me
I
too.
agree. But I think when I heard that, I was taken aback a little bit, because when you strangle a child with an exercise band, that's not an immediate death. That takes time. And in other words, I think there's quite a bit of suffering that you're witnessing and experiencing with your child when you do something that extreme. And when a child is screaming and begging for their life, and we're talking minutes to kill someone with, multiple minutes to kill someone with an exercise band, I guess, depending on someone's strength, that when a child is begging for their life and you continue, does that, and this is the question, does that indicate that the person is not having any remorse or empathy? Does it indicate potentially, and again, I'm just raising questions here, does it indicate that maybe there's a sadistic component to this? Is there a dark side to this story that we don't know? So let's go back to Alice Walker. What's the concealed story? I don't know. That's what I want to know. I don't know what the concealed story is. I think none of us know. I think we're going to start trying to figure that out. But the manner of death here is, as Walker points out, gives us maybe some clues. Now, it could be as simple as she's psychotic, and one of her explanations was that she was hearing voices, that, so perhaps this could be a psychotic break with command hallucinations, which when it comes to psychosis, command hallucinations could be a motive. So maybe it's that, but it certainly raises questions. And the whole idea of premeditation that the prosecution brought up about sending her husband out for food and knowing the exact time how long he would be out. Definitely raises questions about her mental state at the time, whether she was oriented and understood the consequences of her actions, whether she understood the wrongness of her actions. So an insanity plea will typically, or sanity defense will typically involve those components of understanding consequences and understanding the difference between right and wrong. And again, those are probably issues that a mental health professional is going to have to sort through and figure out. But one of the things I think about when I think about, sometimes when I look at a crime scene or think about a crime scene, I think about, is there something metaphorical in this crime scene that can help us understand it? And I this is wild speculation. I could be way off base here, but I'm going to throw this out just as food for thought that, you know, so the exercise bans indicate that the children suffered, that their deaths were not immediate and quick and painless. They were prolonged. And so that certainly raises interesting questions. The other side of that is that so this crime is about suffocation and strangulation, and the metaphor I sometimes think of with her maybe is, does she feel suffocated by her life? Does she feel suffocated by the pressures of work and family and being a mother, and by her high expectations of being a mother, and by maybe her own perfectionism? I don't know. You know, that's a question I have. And so maybe that's part of this, is those really high and unrealistic expectations she has about being a mother and balancing work and family and all these other components of her life. And maybe that was overwhelming for her. So I don't know, you know, again, what's the concealed story in this crime scene?
Which we don't know, but
We don't know.
But as we follow this case, we hope to learn more. And when we do, we'll talk about it here. A lot of great questions here that I'm going to mark down with time codes. But before I do that, I want to thank everyone who leaves their comments and their questions on our YouTube channel after our lives. We go back and look at those before doing our next live to bring up interesting questions and comments. So thank you for those. Always leave your comments and questions if they're not answered on our YouTube channel. I want to start with this, John. Eve's 8827 writes, and Eve's 8827 mentions she's a therapist of 30 years when they write this. I'm guessing that the husband would not have left his wife alone with the kids to get takeout if he had had ever so slightest inkling of what she was about to do. That says to me she was probably pretty good at hiding her inner world and how desperate she ultimately was. That level of subterfuge really complicates assessment and ongoing care. This podcast is the first I've heard of this unspeakable tragedy, and my heart bleeds for all those directly affected by this horrific event. Family, EMT, etc. I cannot imagine what in any universe what that poor husband and father must be going through.
Yeah, this is a really interesting insight, because this gets to some of the issues I want to talk about tonight, and that is, and I want to read back a little part of that quote again, which is, she was probably pretty good at hiding her inner world and how desperate she ultimately was. That level of subterfuge really complicates assessment and ongoing care. Absolutely. That's a great point. So it raises the question I want to raise here, which is, and this isn't talked about that much when we talk about filicide. So last week I talked about the two main types of filicide, and those are psychotic depressed, which is indicative of mental health issues. And the other category of filicide would be more of the psychopathic narcissist type. Those are categories by Jeffrey McKee. He's a forensic psychologist. He's done some interesting work on filicide. And I would still maintain that Lindsey Clancy fits the psychotic depressed type for sure. And as we talked about last week, perhaps somebody like Lori Daybell fits more of the psychopathic narcissist type. So we talked about that last week, showing the distinctions in categories. But there's this idea of subterfuge brings up the question of, or it leads to the question I would ask about Lindsey Clancy, which is, who is Lindsey Clancy in short? We know that her coworkers really loved her and thought she was kind and compassionate, and her husband felt the same way even after she murdered her children. Of course, she's not guilty of anything yet. Let's point that out. So presumably murdered her children.
One of her coworkers, a nurse, said, "I do not know a better mother than Lindsey Clancy. She lived and breathed for her children." Erica Severi. So just an example of numerous letters that were sent to her defense attorney, half of them coming from her nurse coworkers. Anyway, yeah.
Right. But I think, it's and again, I'm raising questions. I'm not saying this is true for her. This is something that forensic psychologists and psychiatrists are probably going to spar over and clash over. They're going to try to figure these issues out. But when it comes to filicide, there is a question about what I would call premorbid functioning, or in other words, how was this person psychologically? What was their mental state prior to maybe having a family, growing up? Were there any issues? Were there any mental health issues? Were there any characterological issues growing up as a child? And how would those factor into a crime of this nature? And I think those could be important issues, because there is some argument that developmental failures or deficits which impact mental health, which then impact or personality. So developmental deficits might impact mental illness and or characterological issues, which then impact our ability to cope with stress, and potentially in a psychotic break, when there's psychosis, that would easily overwhelm any ego controls or defense mechanisms we might have, which would then essentially potentially lead to some type of maybe some type of repressed rage. And so the question I would have, if, as this comment mentioned about her hiding her inner world and the subterfuge, is there some type of repressed rage from her childhood that we don't know about? Are there developmental deficits or traumas or adverse childhood experiences that might be impacting some of her behaviors here? And again, this is not to say that she's not psychotic and that she wouldn't be judged to be legally insane. I'm just asking questions that any good forensic evaluator would ask, which is, how was she functioning as a child and as an adolescent? What was she like pre-family, before she had children? Was this psychotic break highly unusual? Were there any indications of psychosis as a child? Were there any indications of personality disorder deficits, such as borderline personality disorder or narcissism? Right? Those are, and I don't know. It doesn't appear to me that those would be accurate assessments of her, but I honestly don't know. So I think the plot here thickens a little bit based upon the nature of the crime scene, maybe the concealed story that's going on there, and this whole notion of premeditation. And again, somebody can have psychosis. We talked about this last week. Somebody can have psychosis and still engage in a certain amount of premeditation. So that doesn't necessarily mean that she's not psychotic and this isn't a mental health issue. I think it probably is, but I think all these pieces need to be sorted out.
Yeah. A lot of people are mentioning, excuse me. I can't recall what I lost the question I was going to ask, but Moonlight View, and I couldn't find it. She asked earlier, could she be almost I'll say a few things that people are saying. Could she be killing the child that she once was? Other people are asking if she saw a separation between her and the children. Haley Manigold mentioned hearing that she was such a dedicated mother. You wonder if she understood if she had a separation between herself and her children. Those are a few things that are being asked. Shelly Shell, thank you so much. Thank you for delving so deeply, she says, into darkness in order to bring what is hidden into light. Shelly Shell, thank you for understanding what our podcast is about. Thank you. And thank you so much for your compassion.
Thank you, Shelly.
And for your support.
So let me quickly address your last point about, so there is a type of filicide that we did not address last week, and it's called extended suicide. And extended suicide is essentially when a mother sees the child as an extension of themselves. And so if they're going to commit suicide, they want to take their children with them because they don't believe anyone could possibly raise the children as well as them. And they see themselves as ultimately as the only real protectors and people that care for their child. They see themselves as the only ones that can reasonably care for their children. So it's not as common, but there is this category called extended suicide, which goes alongside altruistic filicide and psychotic suicide, or I'm sorry, filicide. So altruistic filicide and psychotic filicide, there is this other category called extended suicide.
Can I share a story about that? You're making me think of a story I know I've told you before.
Yeah.
It's stuck with me forever, and it will forever stick with me. It happened about 10 years ago. And I had a girlfriend that I would travel with, a girlfriend. We used to be coworkers. And as we were traveling on an airplane, she was a single mother. She had an adorable little boy. And as we were traveling on an airplane, she said to me that when she travels with her son, which she loved to do, they were big travelers, she would sometimes worry about the plane crashing and leaving him. And she told me that if the plane ever crashed with them on it, she hoped that they both died. I was shocked, and I remember saying to her at the time, I think that I would do everything in my power to make sure that my child did not, that my child was saved, that I would do anything I would die for my child. And this friend disagreed. And she said, well, you don't have a child yet. You don't know. And lo and behold, now I have a child. And I can say with certainty that if something happened to me or you, John, I would do everything in my power to make sure our child was okay, even if we both lost our lives. And so that gets to what you're talking about with extended suicide, that there are mothers, at least what I experienced, or parents that in some way believe that their children aren't going to do well without them, or I don't really understand it. And we've talked about this before, but I just thought I would bring this up, that this was a real experience I had, that this doting mother, she was a doting, loving mother, but she said, no, I'm worried about him without me.
Right. And this category isn't mutually exclusive. You can still have psychosis, you can still have a break from reality and still have that belief. So it's possible to experience mental illness and still fall into this extended suicidal typology of filicidal mothers. So, but it is interesting to think about that as a potential option here.
Yeah, and I want to say one thing, Jen P, thank you for sharing your experience. This is different than, wanting to stay alive to help your child because they'll know they'll be better off with you in their life. Thank you for working through these difficult times for your child. It was saying, if I leave, I hope he leaves with me. And so I've just wondered if that could be a thought process in other parents. That she was suicidal. If Lindsey and we don't know, we do not know. We do not know. I can't say that enough. But if somebody like Lindsey or, was suicidal and they thought, I need to take my children with me, that's something I've pondered. Our last episode. Oh, do you have anything else to say to that, John?
No.
Okay. In our last Hidden Live, we mentioned religion. We discussed religion and how it plays a role in certain cases. And so I wanted to delve into this. Samantha writes, I wish when you talk about religion in these contexts, you would be more careful to point out that the overwhelmingly vast majority of religious people who make up the majority of the world's population do not murder their children, and that religion doesn't typically cause murder. Cults maybe, but not Main Street Christianity and other religions, and the many non-religious and religious people do both commit these types of crimes. While some evil dictators have killed in the name of religion, others have killed who are atheists. Do you want to explain why you brought up religion when it comes to filicide cases?
Well, so yes, let me clarify. I think it's always a little bit of a risk to mention the word religion in any context on this show because people are so passionate about it and have such strong views about religion. So I always try to be careful. And let me clarify my point. My point was not that religion was the cause of the murders or the filicides. My point was that religion sometimes, not always, sometimes plays a role when people are psychotic, when people are disintegrating, when their selves are completely fractured and they have nothing to hang on to. Sometimes, if there's religion involved or religious beliefs, they will grab onto those beliefs, often in an extreme way. So you'll see during psychotic breaks or when there's psychosis, the religious beliefs tend to be more extreme. And they give that person a lifeline. So my point was that in the case of, for example, we were talking about Lori Daybell, that in many ways, if she does fit this category of borderline personality disorder, religion became a way for her to shore up her identity. It became a way for her to feel more coherent as a self and more whole. And so rather than feeling fractured and disintegrating, it was the religious beliefs, and specifically extreme religious beliefs, that gave her a bit of a lifeline. And so I wasn't saying that religion was the cause of her behaviors or Lindsey Clancy's behaviors or anyone's behaviors. I was merely pointing out that sometimes during psychotic breaks, that religion or political views or ideology, usually more extreme. It's not, again, it's more expansive than religion, but oftentimes more extreme beliefs come into play because a psychotic person will look for a way to shore up their disintegrating identity. And oftentimes that will be something that involves ideology or religion. And so I'm not making a causal connection between religion and murder at all. In fact, I'm just pointing out that the role that religion or ideology might play in terms of helping people cope with mental illness, or more specifically, psychosis in filicide cases.
Thank you for sharing that. Yes, it makes sense to me. Our beliefs are part of who create our beliefs help create who we are, right? Like they are part of assessing what we're all capable of and how that plays a role.
They're a crucial component of our identities. And so psychosis is the loss of or the potential loss of our identities. And so again, that's why somebody may resort to extreme measures or behaviors when they're psychotic because they've lost that sense of self. They lost that sense of identity. They're fracturing, they're falling apart. And I think that has to be one of the worst feelings in the world because it feels like you're not grounded on anything. There's nothing to stand on. Your world you're falling into the abyss. And when you're falling into the abyss, you're more likely to resort to extreme behaviors. Not always, again, like many psychotic mothers, many women and mothers experience postpartum psychosis who never murder their kids. They have a very hard time. They get treatment. Lindsey Clancy sought treatment. She did receive some treatment. They come out of that fine. So I'm only talking about, even with psychosis, I'm only talking about outliers or extreme cases, not all cases.
This next question is kind of heavy. You ready? Because I think that this might be something that's on everyone's mind, or maybe I shouldn't speak for everyone. How about this? It's on my mind.
Okay. I think that's better.
It's from Matt B. He writes, it's interesting for who and for what mental health conditions we choose to have more sympathy. Some suffering appears to be more valid, and maybe it is. A boy who cannot connect with people, has a bad home life, gets bullied, doesn't receive any mental health help, and then acts out with violence like a school shooter is morally reprehensible. However, an adult mother who also has severe mental health problems is getting treatment, kills 3 young children, is more understood, and her pain is felt. I am not sure I agree with how our society selectively applies compassion. It was like, yeah, I hear you, Matt. How do you choose?
Yeah, right. I think so. I don't know if he's referencing Brian Coburger here, but let's say for the sake of argument, he is. You know, you and I, as you know, Lauren, you and I uncovered, or you more than I, uncovered the Tappa Talk forum discussions.
Our team uncovered.
Our team did, yeah.
Team. New York Times uncovered that. Kidding.
Yeah, the New York Times uncovered it, right. Let's give them a shout out.
We're referring to Brian Coburger's Tappa Talk forum, where he was a young teenager sharing some mental health symptoms that he was having on a health forum.
Right. So the 16-year-old Brian Coburger, certainly in my mind, deserves compassion. And I agree that why would we disregard that? Why would we disregard that and potentially extend more compassion to Lindsey Clancy? I will say this. So that's a question. I don't have an answer, but I will say this though, that I talked a lot about, when we talked about Coburger, I talked about a lot about the research of Peter Langman. And Langman essentially makes a very similar distinction. So interestingly enough, Langman essentially categorizes school shooters or mass shooters into 3 categories. The 2 most prominent of those categories are psychotic and psychopathic. Does that sound familiar? So, in other words, if we look at Langman's research and we look at some of the research on filicide, those are the 2 broad categories of both mass shooters and people who commit, women or men who commit filicide. And so I think this idea of compassion would extend more. My take on this for Matt B would be that I think we tend to have a lot more compassion for people with mental health issues as opposed to people that are psychopathic. So the psychopath who has no remorse and no conscience and doesn't care about, so we haven't heard from Coburger, but it seems that he doesn't seem to have a lot of remorse. I mean, I guess we'll find out more. Maybe he does, but I think there's a presumption that mass shooters, at least as adults, as they get older, really just don't care. They lack empathy and remorse. And it's hard as a community. I think you can't have a functioning community without people that have empathy and care about their neighbors. So I think it's harder to extend compassion to people that we either perceive to be psychopathic or that are psychopaths, as opposed to people that are having mental health problems that reach out for help and want help and seek help, and they still commit a horrendous act. So I think, and by the way, in the forensic world, this is a really important distinction because mental health issues are much more likely to be seen as something that would qualify for an insanity defense as opposed to a personality disorder like narcissistic personality disorder or antisocial personality disorder. That personality disorders are seen as way more entrenched and way more difficult to change and not necessarily related to insanity. So I think that is part of the answer to this question too. That in general, I think even in forensic world, even in forensic assessments, that people with psychosis are seen differently than people with personality disorders. So if somebody perceives even the 16-year-old Coburger to be utterly deficient of any empathy, he's probably going to receive less compassion than somebody like Lindsey Clancy, who seems very compassionate, and she's a nurse and people seem to universally love her. She's naturally, I would assume, going to receive much more compassion. And she, which by the way, would take us to the next question.
You want me to read the next question? Number 4. I'm just imagining waking up to myself one day and realizing that I killed my children and the extreme pain of that. I just can't even think about it without crying.
Right. And so I guess that's not a question, but it's an extension of the discussion we're having, which is that I would imagine Lindsey Clancy in the same way, waking up one day and realizing what she did and feeling guilty for the rest of her life and not having a day or a minute go by where she's not feeling some sense of remorse and guilt. And so in some ways, the worst punishment you could ever give her would be to have her deal with that day in and day out. Whereas I think somebody like Brian Coburger, he would not wake up day after day with the same pain and the same suffering that Lindsey Clancy probably would, that he probably doesn't have a lot of remorse. I could be wrong. We haven't heard from him, but let's say in general, let's say we're not talking about Coburger. A psychopath isn't going to wake up with the same guilt day after day and remorse. Whereas I could envision somebody like Lindsey Clancy doing that. So yes. I think this is an extended, this is my extended answer to the previous question.
I think you nailed it, but I also think, when somebody grows up and they hurt complete strangers too, it takes a whole new, it's very difficult to feel compassion for people. I'll just be honest. That's why Matt's question hit me so hard, because it is difficult for me to feel compassion for anyone but the victims when it comes to crime. So I thank Matt for making me think about things.
And this response here is spot on. I agree that CSC says, hell on earth is killing your precious children and being paralyzed to think about it 24 hours a day. Exactly. And so I think that's why we have more compassion for somebody like Lindsey Clancy than we do for a psychopath or somebody that kills without remorse.
Yes. We had a few great comments. Let me see if I can find a few of them. I wrote down time codes, but sometimes they don't stay forever. At 6:09, somebody, I think it was a comment from Jerry, but I want to bring it up. Jerry writes, this case is very different to me than Andrea Yates. She was known to be suffering for months with severe mental illness. This one seems much more spontaneous. But I will say, you know, there was something about Andrea Yates that I read to John earlier, and it felt like there was some planning on Andrea Yates' part as well. She had put the dog, you know, in a separate room that she usually didn't put the dog. She realized how long her husband would be gone and that this was the moment to be able to do this. I do fault him a lot more. She was seeking help. There were a lot more warning signs. It was very clear she had tried to commit suicide multiple times before. All of these things are very different. But premeditation, you know, well, I'll let you talk. She was charged with murder at first, but I guess what I'm trying to say is I see a bit of premeditation there too.
Right. In fact, Andrea Yates was initially convicted of murder because one of the original evaluators talked about the fact that she put her dog in a kennel, and that was an example of premeditation. So, and she had filled up the bathtub earlier in the day with the intent of drowning her kids. So she didn't drown them immediately after she filled up the bathtub. She drowned them later. So that showed some premeditation too. I think the question here, though, is about mental illness. I think the argument she's making, that Jerry Stepp is making here, is that Andrea Yates suffered from much more severe mental illness over a longer period of time versus Lindsey Clancy perhaps being more impromptu and spontaneous. And I think that's part of the question I'm asking is we don't really know. We need to know more about Lindsey Clancy's mental health history and her pre-morbid, in other words, pre-psychotic functioning. And so I think it's possible she suffered from some mental illness, maybe depression, I would guess, or anxiety, but we don't know how severe it was, at least us, you know, the members of the public, we don't know. We don't have that information yet. So again, I think that forensic evaluators will have to tease all that out. I think that's going to be their challenge, is really trying to figure out if this was impulsive and spontaneous as opposed to something that could have existed well before the crimes were committed.
People are asking where Andrea Yates is now. She remains, is it the psych hospital, or she remains not in prison, but is it a, I don't know what you, go ahead.
She's in a state mental hospital. So she's not in prison, but she's more than likely going to be, I would imagine she's going to be confined to a state mental hospital for most of her life, or potentially the rest of her life.
I remember reading once, a few years ago, that her ex-husband still visited her and checked on her, that they would still talk about the kids, but also learned that she had the choice to leave, but has chosen not to. She's chosen to stay there. Thank you, Robin, so much. Haley asked the question, does premeditation automatically invalidate plea of insanity, hidden true crime? That's a great question, because it's, if you know what you're doing, you know, that's what we always say about Lori Vallow. Well, she knew what she was doing, which is true. She did. She manipulated people. She knew what she was doing. She plotted, she manipulated, she planned. But does that automatically invalidate a plea of insanity? Clearly, Lori Vallow is now competent to stand trial, so we won't discuss that with her case. But when it comes to this case or others like Andrea Yates,
it makes it more complicated. So the main distinction with an insanity plea is, does the person know how to distinguish between right and wrong? And then as an adjunct to that, does the person understand the consequences of their actions? So premeditation would suggest that they do understand the consequences. It depends. Again, these are going to be issues for the forensic evaluators. So I'm glad I'm not in their position at the moment. I think this is going to be a really complex case to figure out. But premeditation would imply that someone understands the consequences of their actions, whether they understand the difference between right and wrong, whether they understand that whether Lindsey Clancy understood that killing her children was wrong. I don't know. That's a much more complicated question to answer, but premeditation certainly would speak to a better understanding of consequences as opposed to a violent act that seems to come out of nowhere with no premeditation.
This is a great question, but this maybe gets into evaluating and tests. Because, I think we have the same question with Lori Daybell and other cases we cover, and maybe criminals you evaluate in general. How can we know where Lindsey's responses are authentic and when they are perfected, as they have been prior to the incident?
Yeah, I'm not sure you can know. It's somebody doing a forensic evaluation is going to have to do a lot of testing. And so I always say that there's 3 components to forensic evaluations. There's multiple methods, multiple sources, and multiple hypotheses to figure it out. So the more sources you talk to and the more methods, meaning tests and interviews, and the more data, the more information you have, the better you're going to be able to answer these questions. So I think you're going to have to, in this case, I think there's going to be a lot of interviews and a lot of information that needs to be obtained to start sorting it out. But getting back to one of the first questions you read about how she potentially hid a lot of her inner life and maybe her inner turmoil, that certainly makes it more complicated.
Well, that was the next question from me, actually. Your wife has a question, your co-host.
Okay.
Would her perfected responses imply the way she keeps her life looking perfect to outsiders, that there's a lot more in there and that she is hiding what's really going on inside there that we don't know?
Right. And that gets to the idea that psychosis potentially can overwhelm one's defenses or one's ego controls. And so psychosis has the ability to, whatever's repressed, let's say that somebody who commits filicide has a lot of repressed rage. You would never see that rage. But with psychosis, when the defenses become overwhelmed, then that rage may be more likely to come out. So she could have defended against some type of anger or rage most of her life, and it was never seen. And then for whatever reasons, because of the psychosis or maybe some triggers in her life, I'm not sure, but some of those defenses could have been overwhelmed, and hence you get more of these types of murderous impulses.
Thank you. Stephanie May mentions, do you think she was wearing a mask of despair from her families and coworkers? You just sort of spoke to that. I want to say that question as a comment almost, as what could be possibly be going on. Colette Cox, thank you for being here tonight. And thank you for encouraging everyone to join Dr. John's book club, and to get any bonus episodes, you can head to patreon.com/hidden true crime. We do bonus episodes, and we have Dr. John's. We have Dr. John's book club where this month we're discussing The Examined Life, The Examined Life, which is a book I love, and it's relevant to what we're talking about now. So I want to bring it up, that these things and events that happen in our life and the masks we wear and the things that are buried, they are examined in this book, hence the title. So we hope to see you there on our book club. And it's for also YouTube members as well. John, are you seeing any more comments or questions you want to answer, or?
Just this idea of wearing different masks. I think it seems like Lindsey Clancy might have some perfectionistic tendencies based upon some things that people have said. And I think that would speak to this really strong desire to keep any dark elements of her personality hidden, or to keep any type of anger or rage hidden. And so you wouldn't expect, I think with somebody like Lindsey Clancy, you wouldn't expect to see that often. Maybe at times when she's really stressed out at work, or, maybe some of her coworkers would see some of that occasionally, but I think she's the type of person who would keep that sort of thing really well hidden and under wraps.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of people sharing a lot of their stories of mental health, and I want everyone to know that we did share a phone number in the description of this video for those that are looking for help for postpartum depression, or for those you love, and or for resources, anything that is in the description of this video. I want to remind people of that. And if let's see. And anything else, John, you want to say?
Maybe, do you want to maybe take one or two more questions and then we can wrap it up?
Sure. Yes, Haley, I will. And if Michelle's on tonight, Michelle has emailed me allegedly like 3 or 4 times. I believe her. And for some reason, I have not been able to get these. I've checked my spam everywhere. So Michelle, if you're listening tonight, I don't see you now. And please know I'm trying to find your emails. Colette, to our wonderful moderator, Colette. Yes, will be on News Nation tonight. It is coming up, so we'll end soon. And I will jump on there and we'll be discussing the Murdoch case. Susan D. Yes, there is a helpline for PPD. That is in the description of our video. There is one 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And they offer 60 different languages. I apologize, everyone. I dislike always saying that I am sick. John knows I am sick. He's been taken over the past couple of days because I have been sick. So I apologize about my coughing today. Please forgive me. We just need to bomb our house or get a deep cleaner in because we just keep getting sick.
And we need to somehow figure out a way for our 5-year-old not to come home with every virus known to mankind. So that would help too.
Yeah, I am taking my vitamins. I am taking my supplements. I'm eating very healthy, and truly because of being sick. John knows I'm trying so hard to eat healthy, and we both are. So hopefully things will be better soon. I do need to end soon because of News Nation. But can I share something really quick? Can I share a story? Is that okay?
Sure.
Usually I let you share the story at the end, and if you want to, you can. But I just want to share a little bit of inspiration. So right before this live, John knows, and I have to make sure I think I'm okay emotionally to tell this. Right before this live, I heard some news. So there was a little boy that I nannied, adorable since birth. So I was in college and I was asked to nanny this family after they gave birth to their 4th baby, this little baby boy named Logan. And I was with him for years. I would rock him to bed. I would sing him lullabies, and I loved this little boy. And I learned today, which is maybe why I'm a little off too, and I'm also sick, but I learned that he died tragically in a car accident yesterday. So I want to tell you about Logan because I love this little boy. Logan was different than the rest of his family. And I learned so much from Logan because he came out truly, when you hear about kids, they go to the beat of their own drum. Logan was the epitome of doing life the beat of his own drum. He was very different than the rest of his siblings. So different that it was obvious to everyone. It was clear to everyone just how different he was. And he loved dancing. We would have dance parties all the time when his parents were out of town or had late nights at their house. His sisters just wanted to play with their Barbies. His older brother wanted to do sports. He was everything sports. And Logan would look at me and say, Lauren, will you just have a dance party with me? I just want to dance. And we would dance and we would dance all night long. And he would get in outfits and he always wore purple. And there's a reason I'm wearing purple tonight, because purple was his favorite color, at least when he was 5. It was his favorite color when he was 4. And one thing though, we would go to the church gym, and in the church gym, we'd go there so that his older brother could play basketball. His older brother was such an amazing athlete, and he'd play basketball. And up on the stage in this cultural hall, in this gym, little Logan would be dancing on the stage and performing. And he was this one little boy when the kids were at school and it was just Logan and me, during times when his parents were out of town. I'd ask him what he wanted to do, and I was able to take him shopping with me because he loved shopping. He would say, I just love shopping. And I said to him once in the car, I said, Logan, what's your favorite thing to do? And he said, shopping. I just love shopping. I said, why? And he goes, I just love clothes and I love dressing up. And I said to him, why do you love dressing up so much? And he said to me, because clothes make me feel jazzy. He goes, you can just put on an outfit and feel jazzy. And he would wear the most amazing outfits, even as a little toddler. And as I watched him grow up as an adult, he had the best sense of style. And he was such an artist, and he was so incredible. And a lot of what I did with Logan, I've done with my little boy now. We have dance parties, and we cherish those dance parties. And I let our son go to school today in 2 different pairs of shoes so that he could feel jazzy. And I just want you guys to think this week about, I want us all to maybe embrace jazzy in the name of this little boy who's inspired me to feel jazzy my whole life. When I get comments all the time about my looks. John doesn't, right? You don't, John. just I do. I always get comments about the way I look, whether I need to tone it down or I need to dress up, or some of the clothes I'm wearing are, too much. I actually think of Logan. I think of this boy Logan and how he said, I think what he just taught me was to be you and to be jazzy and to not care what anybody else thinks. Feel jazzy. And so when it comes to Logan and what I've been thinking about coming up to this podcast, it was those lessons he taught me. This boy was an artist until the very end, and he marched to the beat of his own drum until the very end. And the world lost a very, very special soul. But he taught me to embrace jazzy, to never care what anyone else thinks, just be jazzy, just do whatever you want to do, and to have dance parties. Because in our house, right, John, we have dance parties. He won't want to admit, but that's because of Logan. And I'm proud to say that our son loves his dance parties. So in the name of Logan, this week, embrace Jazzy and dance. So anyway, I hope that's okay. And every time I get a comment about my looks, just so everybody knows, I'm only thinking about Logan, and I'll keep doing what makes me feel good and embracing Jazzy. John, anything you want to say? Sorry.
Just, I want to, can we dedicate the show tonight to, can I mention his name? So we'd like to dedicate the show tonight to Logan
Knight.
And I think I would just say that, you know, one of the lessons I've learned over and over and over in my life, and sometimes I don't get it, but as I get older, I'm learning this lesson, and that is that life is so short. So embrace every moment. And now I would add to that, life is so short, embrace every moment and stay jazzy.
Yes, stay jazzy. And the lullabies I would sing to him were Backstreet Boys. When I put him to bed, and I did that for our little guy too. Stay jazzy, sing Backstreet Boys. Yes. And just, this is, purple for Logan. Thank you. Everyone, thanks so much for being here tonight. And until next week.
Okay.
Good night.